Our teachers in homiletics, how to preach and do homilies, discourage us from using jokes, but we still do from time to time. But my niece mentioned when I saw her a couple of weeks ago that a priest in Texas always tells the joke at the end of Mass. So I thought I'd try that, and then maybe discourage people from leaving early, too. They might want to hear that joke. Last week, when I was preaching in the other rotation, I asked in my homily, if Jesus is the absolute center of my life or the people's life that were at those Masses, is Jesus the absolute center of my life? In a sense, today, in this gospel, Jesus is saying, yes, he should be at the absolute center of our lives, because that's where we become our best selves, when we love God above and beyond everyone and everything else. But why should we? You and I and everything in the universe exist because of God's love. And God's love is unconditional. No ifs, ands, or buts. God loves you and me as we are, no matter what's going on in our lives. And that is why we ought to love God back with all our heart, all our soul, and all our mind, and all our strength. When we do, we will live life to the full. That's where we have the best part of our life, is in this wonderful, loving relationship with God. I often use Bishop Barron's definition of love. He says, to love is to will the good of the other. Now, the only problem is, then we say we need to love God first and above all. How could we will the good of God? Because God is pure goodness and pure love. So I think to love God means this, is that I accept, I receive, I trust that unconditional love of God for me. And if I do that, I enter into that loving relationship with God, and I receive that love, I believe it, I trust it, then it's only going to be natural that I share it. And then I share it by doing God's will, and God's will is to love my neighbor as myself. And then I want to do whatever is God's purpose for me, for all those in my sphere of influence. And that's because God wills not only my good, but your good, and the good of every man, woman, and child in this world. That's why the second commandment is right next to the first commandment of loving God, that we need to love our neighbor as ourselves. So loving God, I think, means to trust, to receive, to accept God's love, and then do God's will, to love our neighbor as ourself. And that may sound easy, but it really is more radical than what we might at first believe. Because if we really look, what do we want from others? How do we want another person to look at us and to treat us? We would want understanding, tolerance, respect, loyalty, compassion, all those dimensions of love. If that's what I want, then that's what I need to give to others without distinction. Because God loves every human being and all of creation without distinction. And this is what I mean without distinction. God does not look at us as rich, poor, gay, straight, American, Muslim, refugee, immigrant. He sees the person made in his image and likeness out of his own love. That's what he sees first. These other categories that we have are what we add on to it. It's the external. God sees into every human being made in his image and likeness in love. If you don't have a crucifix in your home, I would highly recommend it and place it in a prominent place in your home. And if you have one already, be sure it is in a prominent place. Because the crucifix is the perfect representation or image of these two great commandments that give us life. Think about this. This vertical beam would represent our relationship with God, which should always be first, to love God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our mind, and all our strength. And the horizontal beam can represent our relationship and love of others. And notice that Jesus is in the absolute center of both of those beams. That's where he needs to be in our life. And he's only going to be there if we love God and love our neighbor as ourself. So the same question, I think, holds as it did last week with our readings. Is Christ the absolute center of my life? For me, not yet. I'm working at it. Is Jesus the absolute center of your life? Probably not. But you're here this morning because you're working at it. It's a process. And the way to make Christ the absolute center is to love God and to love our neighbor as ourself. With all my heart, with all my soul, with all my mind, and with all my strength.